There are moments in life so painful that your body forgets how to breathe. Ella Johnson stood at the back of that church, in a white dress that was supposed to be hers, watching the man she had loved for 7 years slide a ring onto her sister's finger. She didn't cry. She had used up every tear the night before, sitting on the cold bathroom floor, pressing her hands against her stomach where their child had once been. She stood there like a statue carved from grief, watching the priest declare them husband and wife, and the only thought running through her mind was this: she had nothing left. Not a husband, not her sister, not the baby she had quietly buried 3 months ago. Nothing. But what Ella didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly imagined, was that a man she had met only once, briefly, 2 years earlier, had never once stopped thinking about her. And that man was not the kind of man who let go of things he considered his. His name was John Siwon, and he was coming. Let us go back to the beginning, because this story, like all the most heartbreaking ones, did not start with the ending. It started with a girl who believed in love so completely that she never thought to protect herself from it. Ella Johnson grew up in Accra, Ghana, the eldest daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She was the kind of woman people described as too good for this world, not because she was weak, but because she carried everyone else's weight without complaining. She paid her younger sister Abina's school fees when their mother fell sick. She worked 2 jobs when their father lost his position. She sent money home even when she had barely enough for herself. She was the backbone of her family, and her family leaned on her so naturally that they forgot she had a spine of her own. When she met David Mensah at a mutual friend's birthday, she thought God had finally rewarded her patience. David was charming, educated, drove a nice car, and said all the right things. He told her she was beautiful. He told her she was strong. He told her he had never met a woman like her. Ella, who had spent so long pouring herself into other people, finally felt seen. She fell. She fell deeply, completely, in the way that women who have never been truly loved tend to fall. All the way down, with no net beneath her. For 2 years, she gave him everything. She cooked for him, supported his business ideas, nursed him when he was sick, and when she discovered she was pregnant, she wept with joy. David held her and said the words she needed to hear. "We'll get married," he said. "This is perfect timing." And she believed him. But while Ella was buying baby clothes and dreaming of names, something was happening in the shadows that she was too trusting to see. David had been spending more and more time with Abina. Abina, her younger sister, the beautiful one, the one who had always been lighter-skinned and louder in rooms and considered more desirable by the men in their circles. Abina, who Ella had sacrificed her own youth to support. The day Ella miscarried was the worst day of her life. She was 4 months along when the bleeding started, and by the time they rushed her to the hospital, it was already over. She lay in that hospital bed for 3 days, hollow, and the person who visited most was Abina. Abina, who held her hand and said, "Don't worry, sister, you will have another chance." Ella didn't know, lying in that bed, that her sister was already 3 weeks pregnant with David's child. She found out the way women always find out, by accident. A phone unlocked, a message thread she wasn't supposed to see. 243 messages between David and Abina stretching back 10 months. Love messages, planning messages, one that read, "Once she loses the baby, we can finally be together without hiding." The world tilted. Ella read it 3 times before her brain accepted what her eyes were showing her. And then, and this was the part that would define her forever, she did not scream. She did not break things. She quietly locked the phone, placed it back exactly where she found it, walked to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and breathed. In and out. In and out. She was so used to holding herself together for everyone else that even now, even in the most devastating moment of her life, her body defaulted to stillness. She cried quietly, then she made a plan. She did not confront them, she did not tell her parents. She simply began detaching, quietly, piece by piece, like pulling a thread so slowly no one notices the fabric is unraveling. She removed her things from David's apartment over the course of 2 weeks. She stopped being available. And she waited, with a kind of dead patience, to see how long it would take for the truth to surface. It took 11 days. David arrived at her family's house one Sunday afternoon, nervous and overdressed, and he asked to speak with her parents privately. Ella stood in the hallway and listened to him ask for Abina's hand in marriage. She heard her father's confused pause. She heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. And then she heard Abina, her sister, her blood, the girl she had raised almost like a daughter, laughing softly and saying, "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." No one came to check on Ella. No one came to the hallway where she stood, with one hand pressed flat against the wall, keeping herself upright. The celebration began in the living room, and Ella walked out the front door, got into a taxi, and did not return for 4 months. She went to Seoul. It sounds dramatic, and perhaps it was, but Ella had been offered a 1-year contract position with an international textile import company 3 months earlier, and had turned it down because David had said he didn't want her so far away. Now there was no David to consider. She called the company, told them she had reconsidered, and 2 weeks later she was on a plane. Seoul was cold in a way Accra never prepared her for. Not just the weather, though January in Korea nearly shocked her body into rebellion, but the coldness of navigating a city where almost no one looked like her. She was tall and dark-skinned in a sea of people who stared at her with open curiosity, some with warmth, some with something less charitable. She was lonely in a bone-deep way she didn't have language for. But she worked, because working was the thing Ella knew how to do when life tried to undo her. She was 3 weeks into her contract when the night that would change everything happened. Her company held a quarterly networking dinner at a rooftop venue in Gangnam, the kind of place with floor-to-ceiling glass walls and a view of Seoul that looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. Ella arrived in a burgundy dress she had made herself because her mother had been a seamstress, and those skills lived in her fingers. She wore her hair in a high bun, gold earrings, and a quiet dignity that filled every room she entered, whether she intended it to or not. She was standing near the edge of the rooftop, looking out at the city, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She wasn't drinking that night, her heart still too raw for anything that might loosen her composure, when she heard a commotion near the entrance. The energy in the room shifted. It was subtle but unmistakable, the way a temperature drops just before a storm. People straightened. Conversations dropped half a register. And then she saw why. He walked in like a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged somewhere. Tall for a Korean man, nearly 6 feet, with the kind of face that made you think of ancient artwork, structured and severe, and almost too beautiful to be entirely trustworthy. He wore a dark charcoal suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt open, and around his left wrist, just visible beneath his cuff, was a tattoo that curled like smoke. His name passed through the crowd in whispers before his assistant even introduced him. John Siwon. Ella had heard the name before she arrived in Seoul. Everyone had. He was the chairman of JW Holdings, one of the most powerful conglomerates in South Korea, with interests in shipping, real estate, and, if the rumours in the expatriate circles were to be believed, several other industries that didn't appear on any official company registry. He was 34 years old, unmarried, and carried the kind of controlled authority that men twice his age spent their entire careers trying to project and never quite achieved. He was also within 3 minutes of entering the room, looking directly at her. Ella looked away. She was not in the business of being looked at by powerful men that evening. She was barely in the business of existing. But then his voice was beside her. Low, measured, with an accent that wrapped around his English words like silk around stone. You are the only person on this rooftop not performing for anyone, he said. It is very noticeable. She turned slowly. He was closer than she expected, standing beside her at the glass railing, looking out at the city the way she had been moments ago. Maybe I just have nothing to perform, she said. He glanced at her then, a quick, assessing look that missed nothing. Or maybe you are simply too tired of performing to bother anymore. There is a difference. She stared at him, because that was, unexpectedly, uncomfortably, exactly right. John Siwon, he said, extending his hand. Ella Johnson, she replied, shaking it. His hand was warm and firm, and he held hers for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before releasing it. They talked for 20 minutes. She wasn't sure how it happened. One moment she was giving him a polite, closed answer, and the next she was actually speaking, actually present in the conversation in a way she hadn't been with anyone in months. He asked about her work with the textile company. She told him. He asked where she was from. She told him. He did not say the things people usually said. No, oh, I love Ghanaian food, or you speak English so well. He simply listened, with the focused attention of a man who was used to deciding whether things were worth his time, and had decided, in this case, that she was. She left the event without giving him her number. She didn't think about it as a power move. It simply didn't occur to her that he would want it. She was a junior procurement manager from Accra on a 1-year contract. He was John Siwon. She did not know, as she rode home in her taxi that night, that he watched her leave from the rooftop and then turned to his assistant and said, quietly and without preamble, "Find out everything about her." If you're enjoying this story, like and subscribe for more emotional stories like this. The months that followed were ordinary on the surface and quietly devastating underneath. Ella built her life in Seoul with the careful, deliberate hands of a woman who had learned not to expect anyone to build it for her. She made friends slowly, a Nigerian woman named Chisom who worked at a media company, a Korean colleague named Minji who laughed too loud and was deeply kind. She learned enough Korean to navigate markets and read menus, and apologize politely when she inevitably confused something. She discovered that Seoul had a rhythm that began to sync with her own heartbeat, the clatter of late-night pojangmatcha stalls, and the hush of Han River at dawn, and the way snow fell in Insadong, like the city was practicing for something holy. She still cried sometimes at night for the baby she had lost. That grief sat in her chest like a small stone she could feel every time she breathed in too deeply. But she was healing, in the quiet, unsexy way that real healing happens. Not dramatically, but in millimeters. She did not hear from Jeon Si-won. She had not expected to. She thought of him occasionally, the way you think of a strange dream, vividly at first, then fading. What she didn't know was that he had thought of her every single week since that rooftop. His assistant had compiled a file. He had read it once and then set it aside. Not from lack of interest, but because Jeon Si-won had learned, in 34 years of navigating a world that had handed him both extraordinary power and extraordinary loss, that the things worth having were worth approaching carefully. He had his own ghosts. His father, the original chairman of JW Holdings, had built the company in layers, the public conglomerate above, and below it, a network of influence that operated in the dark. The kind of network where debts were collected not in boardrooms, but in backrooms, where loyalty was enforced not with contracts, but with consequences. When Si-won took over at 26 after his father's sudden death, he inherited both the empire and the underworld. He spent the years since trying to pull the company into the light, not out of moral conversion, but because he understood, coldly and practically, that the future belonged to clean hands. But the world he had come from did not let go of men like him so easily. There were enemies, old alliances that expected their tribute, men who wanted him compromised because a compromised Jeon Si-won was easier to control. He had kept himself free of entanglements because entanglements were vulnerabilities. And in his world, vulnerabilities got people killed. Then, Ella Johnson stood at a rooftop railing in a burgundy dress and looked out at Seoul like she was deciding whether to love it or leave it. And something in him, something he had long considered successfully decommissioned, moved. He waited 8 months before he contacted her. She was in a convenience store near her apartment when her phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Miss Johnson. His voice. She recognized it immediately and felt annoyed at herself for recognizing it. Mr. John, she said carefully. I apologize for the unannounced call. I obtained your number from your company's directory. I hope that is not too unsettling. It's a little unsettling, she said honestly. A pause. Then, and she could hear it even through the phone, the faintest suggestion of amusement. Noted. I am calling because I would like to take you to dinner, not for business. Ella stood in the snack aisle of a convenience store in Mapo-gu and thought about all the reasons to say no. She was still healing. She was leaving Seoul in 4 months when her contract ended. He was a man with a complicated reputation and the kind of power that ate ordinary people alive. One dinner, she said finally. One dinner, he agreed. He took her to a small, quiet restaurant in Bukchon Hanok village that she would never have found on her own. The kind of place with paper walls and a private courtyard where snow fell silently and the food arrived like a ceremony, each dish considered and precise. He was different here than she expected, still controlled, still carrying that authority like a second skin, but less armoured. He asked about her childhood. She asked about his. She learned that his mother had died when he was 12, that he had essentially raised himself alongside the company he was being groomed to inherit, that he had a younger sister in Paris whom he spoke to every Sunday, and that he disliked sweet foods with the vehement conviction of a man who had decided this about himself very early and never revisited it. She told him things she hadn't told anyone in Seoul, about her miscarriage, about David and Abina. She didn't plan to. It came out somewhere between the second course and the third, when he asked why she had come to Korea, and she found that the simple answer felt dishonest. He listened without moving. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The people who are supposed to protect us are sometimes the ones who do the most damage, he said. Not as comfort, just as fact. Yes, she said quietly. And you still came. You didn't disappear into grief. You built something. I'm still building, she said. It's not finished. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't entirely decode. The best things never are, he said. By the end of dinner, she wasn't sure what was happening between them, only that something was, and that it frightened her in a way that was different from the fear she was used to. The old fear, the David fear, had been the fear of loving someone who might leave. This fear was something else. The fear of being truly seen by someone who had the resources to do something about it. They met 6 more times over the following 2 months. Dinners, once a walk along the Han River that lasted 4 hours, once a Sunday afternoon in his private library where she fell asleep on his couch reading a book and woke to find he had placed a blanket over her and was sitting across the room, working quietly, as if her presence there was the most natural thing in the world. He had not kissed her. He had not even reached for her hand. He treated her with a deliberate, patient care that was unlike anything she had experienced, as if he understood that she was still fragile in places and was willing to wait at the edges of those places for as long as was necessary. It undid her more than any grand gesture could have. Then one evening, 2 weeks before her contract was due to end, he said something that changed everything. They were standing outside her apartment building, the kind of cold February night where your breath makes clouds, and she was saying goodnight, and he looked at her with that direct, measured gaze and said, "Don't go back." She stilled. "Your contract ends in 2 weeks. I know you intend to return to Accra." He paused. "Stay." "Siwon, I am not asking you to stay for me," he said, which was only partially true, and they both knew it. JW Holdings has a full-time position in the procurement division that would suit your experience precisely. The compensation is significantly better than your current contract. The role exists. I did not manufacture it. He paused again. But if you stay, I would also like to ask whether you are willing to have dinner with me on a more regular basis. She looked at him for a long time. The snow had started again, light and floating, settling in his dark hair. "Is this how you do things?" she asked. "You see what you want and you just arrange the world around it?" "Yes," he said, without apology. "But I would not arrange you, Ella. I would only arrange the conditions. What you do within them is entirely yours." She went upstairs alone that night and sat with it. She thought about Accra, her parents, the house, the ghost of David and Abina's wedding in a church she could no longer enter without flinching. She thought about what she was going back to. And then she thought about this city. This cold, complicated, astonishing city where she had slowly, painstakingly rebuilt something resembling a self. She called her mother. Her mother, who was wise in the way of women who have lived through real things, listened quietly and then said, "Ella, has this man ever once made you feel small?" Ella thought about it. "No," she said. "Never." "Then that," her mother said, "is already more than most people find." She stayed. If you're still with us, don't forget to like this video. It helps us keep making stories like this one. What followed was 6 months of the most quietly extraordinary experience of Ella's life. She and Siwon were not officially anything. They had not defined it, had not labelled it, but they moved through Seoul together like two people who had decided without saying so that they were choosing each other. He met Chisom and was perfectly, precisely cordial. She met his assistant, Mr. Park, a serious young man who looked at Ella with careful respect, which told her everything she needed to know about what Siwon had communicated to his people regarding how she was to be treated. He kissed her for the first time on a rainy April evening in the courtyard of a gallery in Songbuk-dong, without warning and without apology. And she kissed him back with everything she had been holding in her hands since that rooftop in Gangnam. And then she discovered she was pregnant. She was 8 weeks along before she was certain enough to tell him. 8 weeks of sitting with it alone, managing the morning sickness in her office bathroom, pressing her hand against her abdomen in the quiet hours and trying to decide if her heart was ready for this again after the last time. The fear was enormous. But so was something else, something that felt, cautiously, like hope. She told him on a quiet Sunday morning in his apartment kitchen, where she had been making jollof rice with ingredients she'd sourced painstakingly from an African grocery in Itaewon. She turned around from the stove and said, without preamble, "I'm pregnant." Siwon went very still. The kind of stillness that was not absence, but the opposite. The stillness of someone absorbing something with their entire body. "How far?" he said, his voice carefully level. 8 weeks. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, took her face in both his hands, and looked at her, really looked at her, the way he did when he needed to make sure of something important. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm scared," she said honestly, "because of last time." "I know." His thumbs moved gently against her cheeks. "But you are not alone this time. Do you understand me? You are not doing this alone." She closed her eyes. She had not realized until that moment how much she needed to hear those words. "I want you to marry me," he said. It came out less like a proposal and more like a declaration, firm, certain, as if the decision had been made some time ago and he was simply notifying her of it now. "Siwon, not because of the baby. I want to be clear about that." His eyes were steady on hers. "Before you told me just now, I had been thinking about how to ask you for 3 weeks. The baby only confirms what I already knew." She laughed a little shakily, tears sliding down her face. "You could have led with that," she said. "I work in sequence," he said. "It is a personal failing." She said yes. The engagement was announced through official channels, a brief, dignified press release from JW Holdings. Siwon's world reacted in layers. The business community received the news with calculated interest. The media went into a frenzy. Jeon Siwon engaged to Ghanaian businesswoman. And Ella spent 3 days refusing to read comment sections as a matter of self-preservation. But it was what happened in the shadows that she didn't know about. Because Siwon had shadows, and his shadows had been watching. His name was Han Jae-hyun. He was 60 years old, the patriarch of a rival family whose history with the Jeons stretched back 2 generations, to a debt and a betrayal so old that most people involved were dead. Han Jae-hyun had tolerated Siwon's existence because Siwon, for all his attempts to clean up the business, was still navigating the same web, still indebted on some theoretical level to the old agreements that governed their world. But an engaged Siwon was a more formidable Siwon. A Siwon with a child on the way was a Siwon building a dynasty. And a dynasty, in their world, meant consolidated power. Power that would eventually make Han Jae-hyun irrelevant. Han Jae-hyun began to make inquiries about Ella Johnson. He found David Mensa and Abina within 2 weeks. The first sign that something was wrong came when a Korean entertainment gossip site published a lengthy exposé, the kind with photographs and timelines, alleging that Ella Johnson, fiancée of Jeon Siwon, had a long history of relationships with wealthy men, that she had deliberately become pregnant to trap the chairman, and that she had, in fact, abandoned a previous partner and his family back in Ghana. The article quoted sources close to the family and included photographs, real ones taken out of context, and a particularly damaging interview with a man identified only as her former partner in Accra, who said, "She always wanted a wealthy man. She was not the woman she presented herself to be." Ella read the article at her office desk on a Tuesday morning and felt the ground tilt. The words trap and calculated and abandoned family swam before her eyes. She thought about the baby, 16 weeks now, safe and growing, and she thought about Siwon's world and all the people in it who had been looking for a reason to question her. And she felt very alone for a moment, very small, very Ella before Seoul. Then her phone rang. Siwon. "I have seen it," he said. "Siwon, I need to explain. You need to explain nothing to me." His voice was quiet and absolute. "I know who you are. I have known who you are for 2 years. No article written by people being paid by my enemies will change that." A pause. "Are you at the office?" "Yes." "I am sending a car. Come home." She gathered herself and went. That evening, in his apartment, he sat across from her and said, "Tell me everything about this man, David Mensa. Tell me exactly what he did." Not out of doubt, she understood that clearly, but out of the focused, precise way he handled everything. He needed the full picture. She told him, all of it. David, Abena, the messages, the miscarriage, the wedding she had stood at the back of. By the time she finished, Siwon's expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had. Something that she could only describe as cold fire. "He is behind this article," Siwon said. "He might not be doing it on his own," she said quietly. "I don't think David has the reach for this kind of thing." Siwon looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said, "he doesn't. Someone is using him." He stood up. "I will handle it." "Siwon," she reached for his hand. "Handle it in ways that don't involve anyone ending up in the Han River." The faintest pause. Then, with absolute composure, "I will handle it responsibly." "That is not the same as what I said, Ella." He looked down at her, and for just a moment the armor shifted, and she saw something almost tender beneath it. "Trust me." She held his gaze. Then, slowly, "Okay." What happened next unfolded over 3 weeks in 2 cities, and Ella was privy to only some of it. She knew that Shiwon's legal team filed a defamation suit against the publication within 24 hours. She knew that Mr. Park made several trips she was not briefed on. She knew that David Mensa, back in Accra, suddenly found that 3 of his business contracts had been quietly cancelled by their Korean partners, for reasons no one could specifically articulate. What she didn't know, until much later, was that Shiwon had also made a personal call to Han Jae-hyun. She didn't know what was said in that call. She suspected she never would. But 2 weeks after the article was published, Han Jae-hyun's youngest son was quietly removed from a board seat he had held in a joint venture with JW Holdings, and Han Jae-hyun himself gave a remarkably conciliatory interview to a major financial newspaper about the importance of cooperation among Korea's leading business families. The gossip article was retracted. The publication issued an apology so comprehensive it bordered on groveling. And David Mensa's interview was quietly scrubbed from the internet as if it had never existed. Ella watched all of this with a combination of awe and a kind of moral complexity she sat with honestly. She asked Shiwon one evening about the lines he drew, about the things he was capable of that she didn't see. He was quiet for a long time. "There are things I have done," he said finally, "in the world I come from, that I am not proud of. I cannot undo them. I can only choose differently going forward." He looked at her directly. "I want to be someone you are not afraid of, Ella. I need to know if you can believe that is possible." She thought about it with the honesty he deserved. "I think you are a man who is trying to become something better than where he started," she said. "I understand that. I've been trying to become something better than where I was broken." She paused. "I think we can do that together, as long as we are honest with each other." "Always," he said. And she believed him. She was 23 weeks pregnant when Abina called. Ella almost didn't answer. She sat looking at her sister's name on her screen for 4 rings, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Then she picked up. "Ella?" Abina's voice was smaller than she remembered, subdued. "Abina?" A long pause. Then, "I saw what happened, with the article. I heard that David—" She stopped. "He told me he was helping someone. He didn't tell me what it was. I didn't know it was about you." Her voice cracked. "I want you to know I had nothing to do with it." Ella sat with that. "Okay," she said. "I know that's not enough," Abina said. "I know I don't deserve. I know what I did. To you. I've known for a long time." The sound of her crying, quiet and genuine. "You gave me everything, Ella, and I took the one thing." "Yes," Ella said. "You did." Silence. "I'm not ready to forgive you," Ella said. "Not cruelly, honestly. But I don't want to carry the hatred either. So I'm going to put it down. That's the best I can do right now." "That's more than I deserve," Abina whispered. "Yes," Ella agreed. "It is." She hung up and sat quietly for a while, her hand on her stomach, feeling her daughter move, because Shiwon had burst into the most enormous, unarmored joy when the ultrasound showed a girl, had sat in that clinical room looking at the screen with an expression of absolute wonder that she stored in her heart like gold. And she thought about the strange, winding road that had brought her here. A bad man who betrayed her. A sister who chose herself over love. A miscarriage that broke her open. A city she had fled to in survival mode. A rooftop. A burgundy dress. A man who looked at her like she was worth looking at. She thought, Even the worst roads sometimes lead somewhere worth arriving. If this story is moving you, press that like button. It means everything to us and helps us bring you more stories like this one. Jisoo John was born on a clear October morning in Seoul, arriving into the world with the same decisive energy as her father and the same quiet, measuring gaze as her mother. She was perfect. She was luminous. She was the thing that made John Siwon, chairman of one of Korea's most powerful conglomerates, a man who had once overseen boardrooms with the composure of a glacier. She was the thing that made him cry. Not dramatically, just 2 tears, precise and unannounced, the first time he held her. "She has your eyes," Ella said softly from the bed, watching him. "She has your soul," he said, without looking up. "I can already tell." Ella laughed, tired and raw and flooded with a love so enormous she couldn't hold the edges of it. They married quietly 3 months later, not in a grand ceremony, but in the courtyard of a traditional hanok in Bukchon, with Chisom and Minji as witnesses, and Ella's parents flown in from Accra, her mother crying from the moment she landed, overwhelmed by the city and the snow and the man who had bowed respectfully to her and called her Omyonim, mother, in Korean, which had finished her mother completely. Ella wore a dress she had sewn herself, deep gold kente cloth woven through with white Korean silk, because she was both things, and she was proud of both things, and she was not going to flatten herself to fit anyone's expectation of what this day should look like. Siwon saw her walk toward him in the snow, and his breath left him visibly, which she thought might be the finest thing she had ever seen. He slid a simple platinum band on her finger, and she slid one on his, and the officiant said the words, and when he kissed her in that quiet courtyard, with the snow falling and their daughter asleep in her grandfather's arms nearby, it was nothing like the wedding she had once watched with grief carved into her bones. It was hers. Entirely, completely, non-negotiably hers. The years that followed were not perfect, because life, even the good versions of it, is not perfect. There were long nights when Siwon's old world pulled at him, and she lay awake waiting for him to come home, praying a prayer she didn't have the theology for. There were mornings when the grief about her lost first baby surfaced without warning, and she sat with it alone in the kitchen, and Siwon would find her there and simply sit beside her, not speaking, his hand warm on her back, understanding by now that she did not always need words. There were disagreements, real ones, about how to raise Jisoo, about how much of his old world she was willing to tolerate, about the times he made decisions that affected their family without consulting her, because old habits lived in the bone. But they talked. They always talked. That was the thing Ella held on to, that no matter what came up between them, they turned toward each other. They did not perform for the other. They did not pretend. They showed up as the actual versions of themselves, worn and complicated and in progress, and they chose each other in that form, which is the only form that matters. Jisoo grew up bilingual, loud, and extraordinarily confident. A child who had inherited her father's precision and her mother's warmth, and combined them into something entirely her own. She wore her hair in enormous puffs and insisted on Korean snacks and Ghanaian stew with equal commitment, and asked difficult questions at the dinner table, and loved her parents with a ferocity that left them both undone. When Jisoo was 5, Ella founded a small fashion label, textiles designed at the intersection of Korean and West African craft, drawing on everything her mother had taught her and everything she had absorbed in the markets of Seoul. It was not immediately successful. It was difficult and slow, and there were many nights she doubted it. Siwon invested not as her husband, but as a genuine business partner, with the same rigorous due diligence he applied to everything, which she respected far more than charity would have allowed her to. The label grew. By the time Jisoo started school, it was being featured in Seoul Fashion Week. By the time Jisoo turned 8, Ella was fielding collaboration requests from 3 major Korean designers and a brand in Lagos. She called her mother on the morning the Lagos collaboration was announced and said, "Mama, do you remember when you used to sit up past midnight sewing other people's dresses?" "I remember," her mother said. "I think about that a lot," Ella said. "I think I've been sewing my own dress this whole time, and it finally fits." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father and I raised you to believe that being good to people was enough. And you were good. You were so good, Ella. But sometimes good is not enough to protect you. Sometimes you have to find someone who wants to protect you too." A pause. "I think you found him." "I did," Ella said. "I really did." There is a particular kind of healing that can only happen after the very specific kind of breaking that comes from betrayal by people you loved. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive on a particular day with fanfare. It comes quietly, in small moments you might miss if you're not paying attention. A morning when you realize you haven't thought about the old pain in 3 days. A moment when you hear a song that used to devastate you, and it simply sounds like music. A day when you look at the life you've built and feel, not relief that you survived it, not defiant pride that you overcame it, but simple, honest, unguarded gratitude that it brought you here. Ella Johnson-Jeon stood at a window of their home in Songbuk-dong on a winter evening, watching Jisoo in the garden below, attempting to teach her grandfather, Ella's father, on his 3rd visit to Seoul, how to bow properly in greeting, her small face scrunched in deep concentration. Siwon was behind her, his arms around her, his chin resting on her head, watching the same scene. "She has his patience," Siwon said, watching the old man attempt the bow a 4th time under Jisoo's instruction. "She has your stubbornness," Ella replied. "That is a virtue." "That is an opinion." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind she had worked so hard in the early days to earn, the kind that transformed his face. She covered his hands with hers. She thought about the church, the white dress that was supposed to be hers, her sister's laugh, David's ring on the wrong finger, the woman who had stood in that doorway with nothing left. She thought, that woman is also me. She is not gone. She is still in here, but she is no longer the only thing in here. "I love you," she said, not as a declaration, but as information. Simple and factual and complete. His arms tightened around her. "I know," he said. Then, softer, "I loved you first. From a rooftop in Gangnam, where you were the only person not performing for anyone." She turned to look at him. "You never told me that." "I am telling you now," he said. Below them, Jisoo crowed with triumph as her grandfather finally achieved a bow to her satisfaction. He laughed, a big, warm sound that drifted up through the cold winter air, and Siwon's arms were around her, and the lights of Seoul glittered beyond the garden walls, and Ella breathed in, all the way in, deep and unguarded, and let the stone that had lived in her chest for so many years dissolve, finally, completely, into something light enough to live without. Some people will tell you that happy endings are too simple, that life is more complicated, more ambiguous, more painful than any story can hold. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps what happened to Ella and Siwon was not an ending at all. It was simply a chapter, and ahead of them were more difficulties and more grief and more mornings they would have to choose each other all over again. But this is what we know. A woman who had everything taken from her, her child, her love, her sister's loyalty, her belief in her own worth, did not disappear. She got on a plane. She wore a burgundy dress. She stood at a railing and told the truth about her tiredness to a stranger, who was not, it turned out, a stranger at all. She was chosen, not because she performed, or diminished herself, or fit into the shape that other people had decided she should occupy. She was chosen exactly as she was, broken and rebuilding, grieving and hoping, steady and quiet, and made of something that loss could bend, but not break. And the man who chose her was not perfect. He came from shadows. He carried old sins the way powerful men always do, quietly, heavily, in places they don't show anyone. But he chose to become something more, for her, with her, in the daily and imperfect work of building a life that meant something. That, perhaps, is the truest version of love there is. Not the fairy tale where nothing goes wrong, but the real thing, where everything has gone wrong, and you choose each other anyway, and you build something so honest and so specific that no betrayal, no scandal, no article, no rival, no grief can touch the center of it. Ella Johnson had watched her husband marry her sister, and the world had called that her ending. It was only her beginning. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. That means everything to us. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story. Leave a comment below. Let us know. What moment in Ella's story moved you the most? We read every single one. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that what feels like an ending is sometimes just the road turning. We'll see you in the next story.